3/4 of people in Britain think that inequality is too big. But if we're to fix this, we need to understand what causes inequality in the first place. Now, many people will have heard of or have read Thomas Piketty's famous book, Capital, and its famous formula R over G, which basically means that the returns to those who have capital is bigger than the growth rate in the economy. And so ultimately, the rich get richer. For my money though, there's a better way to look at this, and it was set out by a British economist called James Meade in the 1960s. James Meade was a disciple of John Maynard Keynes. He was a Nobel Prize winner. He invented national income accounting, and in his book he set out the 4 ways in which wealth inequality grows over time. He said that first, you have to look at what's happening to incomes. Second, you have to look at what's happening to people's savings and their savings rate. Third, you have to look at the returns that they're getting on those savings. And fourth, you have to look at tax. So let's look at each one of those 4 things to help us understand what's going wrong with inequality in Britain. First, let's look at incomes. The last few years have been extraordinarily good for the richest in our society. The pay of a FTSE 100 chief executive has now soared to an extraordinary £4.2 million. They will earn more in the first few days of January than the average worker will over the entire year. In fact, average workers in Britain have barely had an increase in their wages in real terms since the great financial crash. Now, in the long run, there's lots of reasons for this. Free movement of capital means that firms can move production pretty much anywhere on Earth. And that freedom came just at the time that 1.2 billion people extra joined the global workforce, largely in China. But what that meant is that there was far more downward pressure on wages globally. Second, there was, of course, a lot of automation. If you go onto most factory floors in Britain now, you see very, very few workers and you see an awful lot of robots. But of course, the third big reason was that the power of trade unions was broken and our labour market regulation became very, very weak. There must be about 1 million people on 0 hours contracts in Britain now. There must be at least about another 500,000 people working in the gig economy. And what we see on the Business and Trade Committee is the way that those workers are really poorly treated and really poorly paid. Let's have a look about what that means for the big picture. Back in the 1950s, the share of our national income that went to wages was about 70%. That means that for every £10 earned in the British economy, £7 went to workers. Today, that's fallen from £7 in 10 to £6 in 10. The rest now goes to capital. If British workers today enjoyed the share of national income that they had back in the 1950s, there would be an extra £7,000 in their pay packets every year. That's a hell of a pay rise. Second, let's look at savings. This is really difficult to look at because the statistics that we have are frankly terrible. What we do know is that the wealthiest in Britain have seen their wealth grow by 41 times more than everybody else since 2010, and they now build quite esoteric portfolios of all kinds of things. We don't really know what fraction of their income they save, but we do know this: 25% of adults in Britain have net savings of less than £100. That is a terrible, terrible statistic. This challenge of savings is particularly difficult for young people. Think about what many young people now face today. They face coming out of university with a really high level of student debt that they've then got to pay down. They've then got to save up far more than in the past for a deposit for a home to call their own. They've then got to save more of their income into their pension for the long term because we're all living longer and the state pension isn't worth quite what it used to be. So when you put all of those 3 pressures together, it's really difficult for most young people today to build up a pot of savings to provide for a rainy day. Now let's look at the returns that people get on savings. We know that the richest build these quite interesting portfolios of all kinds of investment assets. We don't really know much about them. Sometimes that's because wealth is hidden in offshore accounts. But what we do know from IMF research into the richest in Norway, for example, we know that the returns that the richest people in Norway were getting was 18% higher than the returns that were being enjoyed by the poorest. And what was really interesting is it would appear that the richest savers have broken the link between risk and return. They were able to get stable, high levels of return over really, really long periods of time. But now think about the big subsidy that we've given to the richest and their returns over the last 10 to 15 years in Britain. We have just put £850 billion into our monetary system. It was called quantitative easing, basically printing extra cash. That held down interest rates by about 1%. And that was a big boost for those who already held assets. In fact, we think about 3/4 of the growth in wealth over the last decade and a half is because interest rates were held down by about 1%. But that wasn't free. Quantitative easing, as it's called, actually costs the taxpayer as a whole over £100 billion to unwind. So here you've got a big subsidy that's been paid for by everybody that has actually helped the growth in wealth of a very few. Now, the final piece of the James Meade puzzle is to look at tax. The best way to understand this is to look at one page, published by Rishi Sunak. It's his tax return. It's a good thing that he publishes his tax return. We welcome that transparency. What it shows is that Mr. Sunak enjoys an income of about £2 million a year, but the rate of tax that he pays is just 23%. Now, how can that be? It's because that Mr. Sunak enjoys most of his income in the form of investment income, and taxes on investment income are much lower than taxes on wages. Here's how this contributes to inequality. Investment income in Britain has now soared to about £80 billion a year. But guess where it goes? Well, 60% of that money goes to the richest 10% of the country, who then pay about half the rate of tax. So, take a step back. There you have it. Those are the 4 big things that are driving the inequality of wealth in our country. Inequality in incomes and wages, inequality in the savings rate, inequality in the returns on savings, and inequality in the taxes that people pay on savings. I think this gives us a good framework to think about solutions to help fix inequality. But before we get onto some of those solutions, we're going to look at the problems confronted by one group in particular, the extraordinary generation that we call Gen Z. And that is going to be next week's video. If you've liked this series, please like the video and share it with your friends and networks. And of course, don't forget to subscribe.